Hello, my name is Grace, and today we're looking at my Project One, an analysis of reading and listening comprehension through closed procedures, a study of English language learners in the Bowling Green area. A quick statistic to start us off is that there are over 44 million immigrants living in the United States as of 2018, and that number is only going to grow in the coming years for a variety of reasons. And of those 44 million, about 78% originate from a country where English is not an official language. So they might have minimal exposure with English, but more than half are expected to not be native in the English language. Those people need to learn English. And I think a lot of us as TESOL minors and people interested in linguistics learn second languages. Think about how you try to learn those languages. I imagine a majority of us probably have Duolingo or Drops, Hello Talk, one of those apps that we can put on our phones, and it's gamification. We just spend a few minutes a day working on it. Maybe you took a college class or a high school class, and some of that information is there. It feels like nowadays, instead of immersion, a lot of it is on the internet, or maybe it's much more academic with homework and worksheets and study books, etc. So that's how a lot of these English learners get this information as well, through classes they're either required to take or go to community centers to take, or through the same online apps that teach English. And those resources are amazing. However, I think to a certain extent, some of those resources could be interrupting the natural flow of how we acquire languages. This chart is a squiggly representation of how we traditionally acquire languages. I was in my elementary education class and talking about emergent bilinguals in the public school systems. And this is similar to a chart that the teacher was showing us. First, they learn how to listen, then they learn how to speak, they learn how to read, finally, they learn how to write. That's kind of the order of importance. And that does make sense. If you think about the L1, you listen as a baby before you start babbling, and then reading and writing don't come until much later in life, like kindergarten and beyond. My hypothesis is, however, I think that some of these online learnings and self-studying and such can disrupt this flow and kind of rearrange it. I think sometimes the way people study languages, you might learn to read and write first, and listening and speaking are on a much lower level of importance. And when you're studying independently and not as a social interaction in some way, it's a lot easier to read on your own than it is to listen and speak on your own. So my investigation uses the Cloze procedure to determine whether ELL adults in the area are able to demonstrate a higher reading comprehension by themselves or a higher listening comprehension. Because according to a lot of the theories I've had in different classes and stuff, it should be listening, but we're going to see whether that was actually the case. Some of the background information, I'm kind of referring more to the grammar translation method, which might be something you looked at in English 407, but it's like a focus on form. So you're looking at literally translating things. You're looking at the specific grammatical rules. You learn the rules first. Something I always think of is Latin. No one speaks Latin anymore, but you learn the rules of Latin, you learn literal translations. I put the Kentucky classes because for me at least, it wasn't an organic Spanish learning experience. It was more like answering worksheets and writing down like key notes. I've been able to learn a lot more Spanish through other means, but if I just had my high school experience, I would not be able to interact with a native Spanish speaker. I'll say that. So that has its place. Of course, you need to learn certain conventions at some point, or else you won't get very far in the language. However, as beginner classes, this investigation might show that that's not always the greatest way to start off a class. I've thrown around the word closed procedure. What the heck is that? The word close comes from closure. And there was an original study in psychology done where there were patterns on a sheet of paper, and participants had to discover what the pattern was, except they were random squiggles and such. And they had to close the pattern by filling in the blank. A close procedure when it comes to literature and passages are going to delete every few words, and you have to use the context clues to close the pattern, close the sentence. And what that does is it tests your semantic skill. For example, one rule we all know is adjectives come before nouns. There's certain cases where they don't, but for the most part, we can assume a word coming before a noun is going to be an adjective or a determiner of some sort. We know that as native English speakers. So this test would determine, would you know that an adjective goes here, or would you put something random like a verb? And it also tests semantics, which is a different way of saying context clues. Like, do you comprehend the reading passage enough to understand what we're talking about? And can you select a word that goes into this passage and makes sense? That's a little abstract. So let me just show you an example. This is the first set of questions that I gave my participants. You start off a closed procedure with a full sentence. So that way we can get a nice idea of what's going on in the passage. So I took the first sentence from the very first Nancy Drew book. So it says, Nancy Drew, an attractive girl of 18, was driving home along a country road in her new dark blue convertible. She had just delivered some legal papers for her father. Blank was sweet of dad to give me this car for blank birthday, she thought, and it's fun to help him in blank work. What you're supposed to be able to do as a native speaker is fill in those blanks. You might not have an exact idea, but this first blank here, you probably understand that needs to be a subject of some kind. So you can like think about that right now if you want to pause and play along. It's like a game. I'll show the answers in 1 second. So these are the answers. There's technically 2 for that one. So if you thought either of those, congratulations, you understand English. That might be a little difficult. You sometimes have to be in the right mindset for it. When I was soft testing these questions with my family members and a couple friends, they were able to get most of these questions pretty instantly and get above a 90% on the test. That's not officially a part of my research, but that is just generally what happens, is that people who speak English get this pretty easily. So now that we've looked at the example, here is the entire thing that I did. If you want to pause this and actually go through it, you can. I'm not going to read through all that because I have a time limit and I'm approaching it quickly, but I got a lot to say, so stick around. Here are my results. So just as a background, I had a medium-sized class of adult English language learners take this exam. About half spoke Karen, and the rest spoke Swahili, Farsi, and Spanish. I didn't include that in my official research, neither did I do gender or age, because it was so sporadic, and I did not find that there was any correlation with native language, age, or gender with my results. They all kind of seem to have the same conclusion, if that makes sense. These are the results. So overall, we can see reading averaged a 54% accuracy and listening scored a 40% accuracy, which doesn't seem very high, but if you paused and looked at those passages, they can be a little bit more on the difficult side. And some of the participants were new to the intermediate class, whereas some had been in the intermediate class for a long time. That was the average. When it came to just syntax, whether or not they could correctly identify the part of speech, reading was also much higher with 67% accuracy. And I want to clarify, they're not writing the word noun or the word adjective. I mean, if the blank is supposed to say the word car, but they put truck instead, they got it syntactically correct. They didn't literally put car, but they knew a noun that was like some kind of vehicle had to go in that blank. So that's why I was judging it there. And then semantic sense, also the reading scored the highest. And semantic sense just means, does it make sense in the passage? So if you paused and read, But if you were to use the word he toward the end of the passage, that doesn't make semantic sense because there's no male character toward the end. So I would count that incorrect for semantic sense. So as we look over at this chart, reading wins by at least 7% in every case. I would say this is pretty statistically significant. They weren't too close together to call. So I went a little bit more specific into syntax because I'm a nerd about syntax. One oddity I found is the listening scored higher in the noun section, but I have reason to believe it was because it was an easy question compared to the noun questions on the independent reading. And that could just be because I only had 20 questions total out of both passages. It maybe if I had a larger sample of questions, like 50, I would have different results than this. But I did not want to subject these sweet volunteers to that many questions. So that is one thing that stands out. But in every other category, there is a much higher percentage toward the independent reading rather than the listening. Again, the percentage is what percent they got correct. There was always at least an 8% difference between each of these categories. And adjective and preposition were definitely much higher in the independent reading section rather than the listening section. What can we do with this information? Let's review the content as a whole because numbers only mean so much to a bunch of English majors. So overall, the reading scores were higher in every category except for nouns. So independent reading proved to be a much easier task and it was simpler to follow than the listening. In fact, the listening took twice as long as the independent reading because people needed multiple questions read multiple times, and they needed more time to think and process what was happening, whereas the independent reading took about half of that time. Then higher syntactic understanding is significant because they were able to see the sentence structures better on paper. They were able to identify with pretty decent accuracy, on the reading section at least, whether a noun, adjective, determiner, and preposition should be placed there. This shows that while they might not have complete comprehension of the passage, they still understand the rudimentary structure of a sentence, like determiner, noun, verb, prepositional phrase. They have that somehow cemented in their mind, whether that be from morphological congruence or just knowing the English language better. They were pretty good at this. In both categories, semantic understanding was a lot lower than I thought it might be, but it was still higher in the reading in comparison to the listening. So they were able to have some semantic understanding in the reading section. So what can I do about this? If I'm a teacher of this class or I do this to future students, how can you fix this problem? Hopefully you watched my project 3. And if you haven't, you could go back and skim through that. I was saying that we need to incorporate more read alouds into English language learning classrooms. And that is because that has a variety of benefits that you might see more in a toddler or someone about to go into kindergarten, first grade, but those benefits still apply to adults. And I think of that as a solution to needing higher listening comprehension. It provides a chance for adults to listen to literature that is their age, because you often find that basic English literature is directed at toddlers, and it provides them that chance to hear a native English speaker talk with the cadence and flow and the vocabulary pronunciation that the learner should be speaking in. So I think that would be the best solution here, would be to incorporate more read alouds into this classroom setting. Another thing that's really easy to incorporate is more social experiences in the classroom. So less worksheets about grammar and more social interactions with each other, more speaking exercises, role-playing exercises between the teachers and the students or any other like English speakers that might be there. I've not been able to incorporate the read alouds into this group of people, but we did incorporate more English speaking opportunities within the classroom, and the students seem to enjoy that more. So in the future, if I wanted to see if these two solutions are actually solutions, I could perform another Cloze test, perhaps like 6 months down the road, and see what the difference is between the two and if they've gained more knowledge. So my concluding thoughts is, do not get me wrong, grammar is very important. We can also improve syntactic and semantic conventions through listening exercises, through social interaction, and read alouds. I think the most interesting finding of all is that the group of participants performed better on independent reading. I would have imagined they listen to English throughout their day more. They just performed so much better on the independent reading. The average of that group has apparently spent more time reading English and understanding written words rather than vocal words. I think all of these ideas are stuff you should consider if you're going to teach English or you're going to be a teacher in a classroom where you might have emergent bilinguals. Thank you. I hope this gave you some new insights to your future English language teaching.